Some say the old bricks on the south side don't just hold up roofs, they hold on to memories. If you listen closely enough, past the hum of the city and the distant sirens, those walls will tell you stories of survival. They speak of black folks who were told where they couldn't live, who couldn't get a bank loan because a callous pen drew a thick red line around their zip code, but who built a sanctuary out of sheer defiance anyway. Under the pale morning sun, Martha knelt in the dirt. She was 72 years old, her silver hair woven into neat, dignified lokes, and her eyes held that specific kind of warmth that only comes after surviving the worst this country has to offer. She hummed an old, soulful Mahalia Jackson tune, her dark, weathered hands gently pruning a vibrant red rosebush. Dirt was deeply embedded under her fingernails, the honest mark of a woman who nurtured life from barren soil. Her house, a modest brick structure, with peeling porch paint and wooden steps that groaned underfoot, stood as a quiet testament to a bygone era. To the untrained eye, Martha was just another sweet, fragile old black woman left behind by time in a forgotten, struggling neighborhood. A neighborhood that its developers had suddenly rebranded as up and coming, and everyone knew exactly what that meant. It meant the culture was about to be priced out, erased, and replaced. Miles away, the air smelled completely different. It didn't smell like damp earth and blooming roses. It smelled like cold espresso, expensive cologne, and ruthless ambition. A pristine obsidian black Tesla Model S glided silently to a halt in front of a towering skyscraper composed entirely of mirrored glass, the headquarters of Vanguard Elite. The heavy door swung open, and out stepped Marcus. At 42, he possessed a sharp jawline and an even sharper haircut. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most families in his mother's neighborhood, made in 3 months of back-breaking labor. Marcus stepped onto the polished marble plaza, walking with a specific, calculated arrogance, the kind that silently demanded everyone else clear the path. He tapped his AirPod aggressively, his face contorted in annoyance. "I don't care, Richard." Marcus barked into the invisible microphone, his voice sharp and devoid of empathy. "I do not care if the Williams family has lived in that unit for 20 years. They missed rent by 4 days. Serve the eviction notice by noon. We are rebranding that entire block. The new demographic moving in wants a rooftop Pilates studio and artisanal coffee, not a neighborhood grievance committee. Clear them out. We are sanitizing this zip code." As he strode through the gleaming lobby, junior executives nodded at him in deference. He didn't nod back. Marcus spoke with a clipped, polished corporate tone, a cadence specifically designed to erase any trace of where he came from. He didn't see families, he saw square footage. He didn't see history, he saw a balance sheet waiting to be optimized. Marcus had spent his entire adult life running away from his blackness, fleeing his roots, desperate to prove to a boardroom full of old white men that he was one of the good ones. To him, wealth had to be loud. Power was a corner office on the 50th floor, looking down at the ants below. But true power is rarely loud. It doesn't need to be. Back in the quiet embrace of the South Side, Martha's house smelled of cinnamon, peach cobbler, and old pine wood. The furniture was dated, carefully preserved under clear plastic covers, looking perfectly, beautifully humble. Martha wiped the soil from her hands and slowly walked into her bedroom. She paused in front of a framed black and white photograph resting on her dresser. It showed her and a handsome young man, her late husband Arthur. They were standing in front of this very house decades ago, their faces shining with defiant pride, holding a handwritten sold sign. A gentle, melancholic smile touched her lips, but a deep, heavy sorrow clouded her eyes. Wincing slightly from the ache in her knees, Martha knelt beside her heavy oak bed frame and reached underneath. She pulled out a battered, heavy mahogany cigar box. It looked exactly like the kind of box where a struggling grandmother might keep some loose change, old food stamps, or a collection of past-due utility bills. Martha let out a shaky breath. Her trembling fingers reached for the small brass key she wore on a chain around her neck, tucked close to her heart. With a soft metallic click, the lock gave way. She opened the heavy lid. Inside, there were no past-due bills. There were no food stamps. Instead, the box held thick, leather-bound ledgers, stacks of certified bank statements with balances that defied imagination. And deeds, dozens and dozens of property deeds, title after title, neatly stacked and meticulously preserved. Martha's calloused fingers slowly traced down the column of assets. The numbers printed there weren't in the thousands. They weren't even in the single millions. The net worth sat quietly, undeniably, in the hundreds of millions of dollars. She owned the bustling laundromat on 4th Street. She owned the entire commercial strip mall on 8th. And resting near the very top was a document bearing the sleek corporate logo of Vanguard Elite. It proved that her holding company possessed the majority shareholder voting rights to the very firm her son worked for. Martha was not just a sweet old lady clinging to a gentrifying neighborhood. She owned the neighborhood. She was the ghost billionaire of the South Side. "We bought the block, Arthur," Martha whispered to the empty room. A single tear escaped her eye, tracing a path down her weathered cheek. Her voice trembled, thick with a heartbreaking mix of maternal sorrow and a sudden, terrifying resolve. "But our boy is trying to sell its soul. It's time I teach him what real power looks like." The small brass key felt warm against Martha's chest as she carefully locked the mahogany cigar box. She slid it back under the heavy oak bed frame, her movements slow, deliberate. Every time she looked at those leather-bound ledgers, the ghosts of 1974 came rushing back into the room. They didn't come with the haunting wails of a horror story. They came with the quiet, suffocating humiliation of a white-collar office. She closed her eyes, and suddenly the scent of peach cobbler was replaced by the sterile smell of lemon polish and stale cigarette smoke. It was a Tuesday morning, the First National Bank of Chicago. Martha remembered sitting in a stiff leather chair opposite a loan officer named Mr. Henderson. Arthur sat beside her, wearing his own only sensei suit, the one she had meticulously pressed the night before, making sure the lapels were perfectly sharp. He had scrubbed his hands for an hour that morning, trying to wash away the stubborn black grease from the auto shop, wanting to look like a man worthy of a mortgage. Martha's belly was swollen, heavy with a baby boy they had already decided to name Marcus. They had saved for 5 years. Every penny squeezed from Arthur's double shifts and Martha's late-night sewing jobs. They had the down payment, they had the credit, but they had the wrong zip code, and, more importantly, the wrong skin color. "It's a beautiful starter home, Arthur, it really is, Mr. Henderson had said, offering a tight, patronizing smile that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. He tapped his gold pen against a map spread across his desk. A map covered in thick, aggressive red lines drawn around the South Side. But the bank's policy is quite clear on risk assessment in this. Specific demographic area. The property values simply don't project well. We have to protect our investors. I'm sure you understand. I'm sure you understand." Those 4 words echoed in Martha's mind for decades. They didn't say the word black. They didn't have to. The red line on the map said it for them. It was a silent, systemic violence that didn't leave bruises on the skin, but it shattered the spirit. Arthur didn't yell. Black men in 1974 knew that raising their voice in a room full of white men in suits was a dangerous, often fatal, gamble. Instead, Arthur just slowly reached over, taking Martha's trembling hand in his large, calloused one. He squeezed it, a silent promise. "They can deny us the paper, but they can't deny us the sweat." And sweat they did. If the front door of the American dream was locked, Arthur and Martha decided to build their own door from scratch. Arthur took a 3rd job working the graveyard shift at the steel mill. He would come home at dawn, his clothes smelling of sulfur and burnt iron, sleep for 4 hours, and go to the auto shop. Martha started cleaning houses for wealthy white families in the northern suburbs, the very neighborhoods where people like Mr. Henderson lived. She ironed their silk sheets and scrubbed their porcelain tubs, swallowing her pride, hoarding every dollar in a tin coffee can under the floorboards. But money alone couldn't beat the system. They needed a ghost. They needed a proxy. Enter Elias Thorne. He was a young, idealistic white lawyer who had marched in Selma and carried a heavy conscience. He became their front man. When a property on the South Side went into foreclosure, or was abandoned by fleeing landlords, Elias would buy it on paper. But the money, the cold, hard cash stacked in envelopes, came from Arthur and Martha. Brick by brick, block by block, they bought back their own community. They didn't evict the struggling single mothers, they lowered the rent. They didn't board up the failing corner store. They forgave a month's lease so the owner could restock. They operated in total secrecy, forming the Arthur's Legacy Trust. To the outside world, the South Side was owned by a faceless corporate entity. Only Elias, Arthur, and Martha knew the truth. The neighborhood belonged to the people who actually bled for it. Arthur's heart gave out in 1998. The steel mill had taken its toll. He died on the very porch where Martha now grew her roses. He never lived to see the trust's net worth cross the billion-dollar mark. He never got to wear a Rolex or drive a luxury car. But as he took his last breath in Martha's arms, he looked at the street they secretly owned, smiled, and whispered, "We kept them safe, Martha. We kept them home." Martha opened her eyes, pulling herself out of the memories. She wiped a stray tear from her cheek. This was why she still lived in the drafty brick house. This was why she didn't wear Gucci or drive a Mercedes. Generational wealth to her wasn't about flashy displays of consumption to impress people who secretly despised her. Wealth was a shield. Wealth was the ability to ensure that no black child in her zip code would ever have to sleep in a car. She grabbed her light cardigan and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The afternoon sun bathed the neighborhood in a warm, golden glow. As she walked down 8th Street, the vibrant pulse of the community surrounded her. Children drawing with chalk on the pavement, the smell of barbecue drifting from a backyard, the rhythmic thumping of old-school R&B from a passing car. But as she approached Miss Shirley's hair boutique, a neighborhood staple for 30 years, the music faded, replaced by the sharp, distressed sound of crying. Martha frowned and pushed open the glass door. The salon smelled of sweet hairspray and burning flat irons, but the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Miss Shirley, a proud, robust woman in her 60s, was wiping her eyes with a towel. Standing in the middle of the salon, looking entirely out of place, was a man in his 30s. Let's call him Greg. Greg wore a slim-fit pastel suit, loafers with no socks, and the smug, entitlement-laced smirk of a mid-level gentrification vulture. He was holding a clipboard. "Look, Shirley, it's just business," Greg was saying, his voice entirely too loud for the small space. "The neighborhood is transitioning. My investment group just closed on this building this morning. Property taxes are going up, so the rent is going up. $3,000 a month starting the 1st. If you can't pay it, you have 30 days to vacate. Time to move on, ladies. We're putting a vegan juice bar in here." The 3 other hairdressers in the shop stopped working. A heavy, helpless silence fell over the room. $3,000 a month was a death sentence for a local salon. It was a legal eviction disguised as a market adjustment. Martha stood near the doorway, her face impassive. She didn't yell. She didn't march up to Greg and cause a scene. Old money, true power, never raises its voice. It doesn't have to. She simply looked at Greg. She memorized his pastel suit, the logo on his clipboard, and the arrogant tilt of his chin.
"Everything all right, Shirley?"
Martha asked softly. Greg turned, looking Martha up and down, dismissing her instantly as just another broke elderly resident. "Everything is fine, Grandma, just explaining the realities of the free market." Martha offered him a small, chilling smile. "The market can be quite unpredictable, young man. You should be careful." Without another word, Martha turned and walked out of the salon. She didn't go far. She sat on the wooden bench at the bus stop across the street, pulled a sleek, encrypted smartphone from her worn canvas tote bag, and dialed a number. It rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Chairman." It was David, the current lead attorney for the trust, Elias Thorne's protege. "David," Martha said, her voice dropping an octave, slipping effortlessly from the sweet neighborhood grandmother into the ruthless CEO of a billion-dollar empire. "I need you to look up an investment group that just purchased the commercial property at 814 East 8th Street. "Give me 30 seconds, ma'am," David replied. The rapid clacking of a keyboard echoed over the line. "Ah, found it. A small-time LLC, over-leveraged. They've been taking out high-interest mezzanine loans to buy up properties in the South Side. Who holds their primary debt? A mid-sized regional bank, but the loans are packaged and currently being shopped around on the secondary market. Martha watched from across the street as Greg walked out of the salon, whistling a cheerful tune, spinning his car keys around his finger. He thought he was the king of the block. "Buy the debt, David," Martha ordered softly. "Buy all of it. Pay a premium if you have to. I want it done within the hour." "Understood, ma'am. And once we hold their debt?" Martha's eyes narrowed into dark, dangerous slits. "Call it in, immediately. Demand full repayment by tomorrow morning due to their over-leveraged risk profile. When they inevitably default, initiate a hostile takeover of their LLC. Liquidate their assets and transfer the deed of 814 8th Street directly into our primary trust." "Consider it done, Mrs. Chairman. Anything else?" "Yes. Draft a new lease for Shirley's Hair Boutique. 10 years. Lock the rent at $800 a month. Put a bow on the envelope." Martha hung up the phone and slipped it back into her canvas bag. She stood up, smoothed her cardigan, and walked back to her house to tend to her roses. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up exactly the same, but the power dynamic had shifted like tectonic plates in the night. Greg was nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it he was currently sitting in a downtown office, sweating profusely, screaming at his bankers as his entire mini-empire collapsed around him in less than 24 hours. He had tried to play Monopoly in a neighborhood where Martha owned the board. Around 10 a.m., a tall, impeccably dressed black man in a tailored suit walked into Ms. Shirley's salon. He didn't carry a clipboard. He carried a heavy, cream-colored envelope wrapped in a subtle gold ribbon. He handed it to Shirley with a respectful nod, said, "Compliments of the new management," and left. Shirley opened the envelope with trembling hands. When she read the 10-year lease agreement with the rent locked in at $800, she burst into tears. But this time, they were tears of profound relief. Martha was sitting under the hairdryer in the corner of the salon, a magazine resting on her lap. Shirley looked over at her, holding the paper to her chest, completely bewildered by the miracle that had just occurred. Martha caught her eye in the mirror. She didn't say a word. She just took a slow sip of her sweet tea, offered a slow, knowing wink, and went back to reading her magazine. She had bought back her peace. But as she turned the page, the thought of her own son, Marcus, sitting in his glass tower, plotting to do exactly what Greg had tried to do, but on a massive scale, sent a cold shiver down her spine. The outsides of vultures were easy to crush, but how do you crush a vulture when he has your blood running through his veins? Chào bạn. Tiếp tục với mạch truyện này, thú thật là tôi thấy hơi nghẹn đắng khi phác thảo những dòng tâm lý của Marcus trong phần 3. Tôi buộc phải đặt mình vào vị trí của một người đang cố gắng chối bỏ chính máu thịt của mình chỉ để đổi lấy một chiếc ghế bọc da trong phòng họp. Đó là một cảm giác rất nhức nhối. Ở phần này, chúng ta sẽ lột tả sự tàn nhẫn của quá trình tẩy trắng đô thị, gentrification, không phải bằng máy ủi hay cần cẩu, mà bằng những biểu đồ lợi nhuận và những tràng cười nhạt nhẽo trong phòng máy lạnh. Mời bạn cùng tôi bước vào thế giới ngột ngạt của Vanguard Elite nhé. Part 3. The shadow of gentrification. The air on the 50th floor of the Vanguard Elite Tower didn't breathe. It was mathematically calibrated, filtered, and chilled to exactly 68 degrees. A temperature designed to keep men in heavy wool suits comfortable while freezing out anyone who didn't belong. There was no scent of life here, no sweet tea, no blooming roses, no history. Just the sharp, sterile tang of ozone from the copy machine's expensive leather and the subtle, lingering trace of Tom Ford cologne. Marcus stood in front of the floor-to-soiling window of his corner office, staring down at the sprawling grid of Chicago. From up here, the people looked like microscopic insects, and the neighborhoods were just colored squares on a monopoly board, waiting to be bought, sold, or bulldozed. He adjusted the Windsor knot of his Italian silk tie, checking his reflection in the tinted glass. He looked perfect. He had to be. Being the only black executive on the 50th floor meant Marcus didn't just wear a suit. He wore a psychological suit of armor. He had mastered the exhausting, soul-crushing art of code switching so entirely that he sometimes forgot what his real voice sounded like. When he walked into the lobby every morning, He stripped away his South Side cadence, his cultural references, and any hint of the boy who used to play in the fire hydrants on 8th Street. He replaced them with a carefully curated persona, the safe black man. Articulate, agreeable, ruthlessly capitalistic, and entirely severed from his roots. Marcus believed this was the price of admission. He remembered the smell of his father's grease-stained hands. He remembered the exhaustion etched into his mother's face when she returned from cleaning white people's houses. He looked at their struggle not with reverence, but with a deep, paralyzing shame. He had sworn to himself a long time ago that he would never be a victim of the system. Instead, he decided to become the system. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. His sleek glass desk phone lit up. Mr. Hayes, his assistant's voice hummed through the speaker. Richard and the board are ready for you in conference room A. Marcus took a slow, measured breath. Thank you, Chloe. I'm on my way. Conference room A was a cavern of mahogany and frosted glass. Around the massive oval table sat the board of directors, 8 older, exceedingly wealthy white men, their faces marked by decades of unchallenged authority. At the head of the table sat Richard Sterling, the CEO of Vanguard Elite. Richard was a man who smiled with his teeth but never his eyes. He swirled a heavy crystal glass of scotch, even though it was barely 11 a.m., and looked up as Marcus entered. Marcus, my boy, Richard beamed, gesturing expansively with his free hand. Show us the future. With pleasure, Richard. Marcus stepped up to the podium, tapping a button on his tablet. The lights dimmed, and a massive 3D holographic projection materialized in the center of the table. It was a breathtaking architectural marvel. Towering structures of gleaming glass, steel, and eco-friendly vertical gardens. Rooftop infinity pools glimmered under artificial digital sunlight. The streets were wide, lined with artisanal coffee shops, high-end yoga studios, and organic grocers. It looked like a utopian paradise. Gentlemen, I present to you the Zenith, Marcus announced, his voice smooth, confident, and utterly devoid of emotion. A billion-dollar mixed-use luxury development that will completely redefine urban living in this city. The board members leaned in, their eyes reflecting the digital glow of the projection. They didn't see architecture, they saw profit margins. It's beautiful, Marcus, Richard said, taking a slow sip of his scotch. But where exactly are we putting this masterpiece? Land in the prime districts is tapped out. Marcus swiped on his tablet. The beautiful 3D glass towers dissolved, replaced by a gritty, top-down satellite view of a neighborhood. It was the South Side. It was 8th Street. It was Martha's Street. We aren't building in the prime districts, Richard. We are going to create the new prime district, Marcus said, dragging a digital red boundary line across the map, a sickening modern echo of the very redlining that had oppressed his parents decades ago. This area is currently classified as a blighted zone. It's an untapped asset class suffering from severe urban decay. The current demographic is stagnant. Crime rates, while dropping, still suppress property values. The infrastructure is obsolete. It is, for all intents and purposes, a slum. A heavy silence hung in the room. Marcus was talking about the streets where his father had bled. He was pointing a laser pointer at the exact coordinates of Ms. Shirley's hair boutique, dismissing it as obsolete infrastructure. He dragged the cursor right over the roof of his mother's brick house, labeling it an inefficient use of space. By leveraging aggressive eminent domain lobbying, targeted buyouts, and strategic eviction notices for renters, we can clear this entire 10-block radius within 14 months, Marcus continued, his tone as clinical as a surgeon removing a tumor. We sanitize the zip code. We replace the outdated, low-income housing with the Zenith. The property values will skyrocket by 400% overnight. We aren't just building condos, gentlemen. We are pioneering aggressive urban renewal. Urban renewal. The sterilized, corporate euphemism for the destruction of a community. The corporate word for erasure. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He looked at the satellite map, then looked at Marcus. I have to admit, Marcus, I love the aggression. The profit margins here are staggering. But, dealing with those neighborhoods. Richard paused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. It can be messy. The locals tend to get very loud. They cling to that dirt like it's holy ground. The locals won't be a problem, Marcus replied smoothly, though a tiny muscle in his jaw twitched. Most of them are renters on month-to-month leases. The homeowners are elderly, living on fixed incomes. When we slap them with aggressive property tax reassessments, they'll be forced to sell. We offer them a fraction of the post-development value, and they'll take it because they have no legal firepower to fight us. It's simple economics. Richard chuckled, a low, grating sound that seemed to lower the temperature in the room by another 10 degrees. He looked around the table at the other board members, sharing a knowing, conspiratorial glance. Simple economics. I like that, Richard said. He set his glass down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany table. You know, Marcus, I drove through that exact neighborhood a few years ago. Got lost on my way to a charity gala. God-awful place. Richard let out a heavy sigh of exaggerated disgust. Honestly, doing this project, we're doing the city a massive favor. Finally cleaning up the riffraff, sweeping out the trash. The room went dead silent. The words hung in the chilled air, toxic and heavy. Riffraff. Trash. Richard wasn't just talking about buildings. He was talking about people. He was talking about Arthur, who worked 3 jobs until his heart gave out. He was talking about Martha, who scrubbed floors so Marcus could go to college. He was talking about the black community that had survived decades of systemic starvation. Marcus froze. For a split second, just a fraction of a heartbeat, the polished corporate mask slipped. A sudden, sharp spike of nausea hit the back of his throat. The ghosts of the South Side screamed in his ears. He remembered his mother's calloused hands. He remembered the pride in his father's voice when he talked about their neighbors. Say something, a tiny, suffocating voice in his mind pleaded. Defend her, defend them. You are a black man. Say something. Richard looked up at Marcus, his pale blue eyes gleaming with an unspoken challenge. It was a test. It was always a test. The board members watched in silence, waiting to see if the safe black executive would remember his roots, or if he would prove his absolute, unwavering loyalty to the bottom line. Richard smirked, adding the final, agonizing twist of the knife. I mean, really, we give them a modest buyout, and what are they going to do with it anyway? Probably blow it all on new rims for their cars and overpriced sneakers, right? They don't know the value of the dirt they sleep on. A few of the board members let out a low, privileged chuckle. Marcus stood at the podium. His hands gripped the edges of the wood so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The silence stretched, agonizing and thick. He looked at Richard. He looked at the men laughing at the systematic destruction and humiliation of his people. And then, Marcus did the unforgivable. He didn't yell. He didn't flip the table. He didn't defend his mother's honor. Marcus forced the corners of his mouth to curl upward. He pushed down the nausea, buried the ghosts, and let out a smooth, hollow laugh that echoed through the boardroom. Exactly, Richard, Marcus said, his voice dripping with enthusiastic agreement, the final nail in the coffin of his own soul. We're practically doing them a favor. They wouldn't know what to do with real wealth if it was handed to them. The zenith is exactly what this city needs. Richard's smile widened into a full, triumphant grin. He raised his glass of scotch toward Marcus. To the zenith, then. And to you, Marcus, you truly are one of us. To the zenith, Marcus echoed, raising an imaginary glass. As the board members applauded and began discussing budget allocations, Marcus looked back at the satellite projection of 8th Street. He stared at the tiny, pixelated roof of his mother's house, mentally bulldozing it to the ground. He had just sold his community, his history, and his own mother for a seat at a table that would never truly respect him. He had secured the project. He had secured his promotion. But as he stood in the freezing, sterile air of the 50th floor, Marcus Hayes had never been more spiritually bankrupt in his entire life. He just didn't know it yet. The obsidian black Tesla Model S moved down 8th Street like a sleek, predatory shark gliding through shallow, murky waters. The car's adaptive air suspension struggled against the jagged potholes and uneven asphalt of the South Side, sending slight, irritating tremors through the plush leather interior. Inside the cabin, the air was heavily filtered, isolating Marcus from the sounds and smells of the neighborhood. But he could still see it. Through the tinted, UV-protected glass, he watched the cracked sidewalks, the faded murals of civil rights leaders painted on brick walls, and the groups of young black men sitting on stoops. As the Tesla rolled past, conversations stopped. Kids paused their basketball games on the corner. Everyone stared. A car like that didn't belong here unless it was bringing trouble. Marcus gripped the leather steering wheel, his knuckles tight. He hated this drive. He hated the way the dust settled on his pristine rims, and he deeply, viscerally hated the memories that clung to every street corner. He pulled up to the curb in front of his mother's house. The front left tire crunched against a patch of overgrown weeds. He turned off the engine, but he didn't get out immediately. He sat there, taking a deep breath of the sanitized, climate-controlled air, preparing himself to step into the past. On the porch next door, Uncle Joe, a 75-year-old retired postal worker who had lived on the block since before Marcus was born, was sitting in a rusted folding chair. Joe leaned heavily on his wooden cane, squinting at the expensive car. When Marcus stepped out, smoothing the wrinkles from his tailored charcoal suit, Joe's face broke into a warm, toothy smile. "Little Marcus? Well, I'll be damned," Joe called out, his voice raspy but full of genuine affection. "Look at you, boy. All dressed up like you own the downtown. Your mama inside, she was just..." Marcus didn't even turn his head. He didn't wave. He simply locked the car with a sharp chirp from his key fob and walked briskly up the walkway of his mother's house, leaving Uncle Joe's greeting hanging in the heavy, humid air. The wooden steps groaned in their familiar, tired way as Marcus climbed onto the porch. He didn't knock. He didn't call out. He just pushed the screen door open, the rusty hinges squealing in protest. Inside, the house smelled exactly as it had for 30 years, a comforting blend of pine wood, cinnamon, and the lingering sweetness of peach cobbler. But to Marcus, the scent was suffocating. It smelled like stagnation. It smelled like poverty. He pulled a monogrammed silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and discreetly pressed it against his nose, his eyes scanning the living room with utter disdain. The plastic-covered floral sofa, the ancient tube television, the faded rug. "Mama," Marcus called out, his tone sharp, devoid of any warmth. Martha emerged from the kitchen, wiping her damp hands on a floral apron. When she saw her son standing in the living room, her face lit up with that unconditional, radiant joy that only a mother possesses. "Marcus, baby, you didn't tell me you were coming," Martha said, her eyes crinkling at the corners. She moved toward him, her arms opening for an embrace. "I just put a cobbler in the oven. Have you eaten? You look so thin in the face." Marcus took a deliberate step back, holding up a hand to stop her. "I'm not here to eat, Mom. And please, don't touch the suit. I have a meeting with the zoning board in an hour." Martha's arms dropped slowly to her sides. The warmth in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a sudden protective caution. She looked at her son, really looked at him. The expensive suit, the cold, empty eyes, the way he stood in the center of her home as if he were inspecting a contaminated site. "All right," Martha said quietly, wiping her hands on her apron again. "What brings you all the way down here, Marcus?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He walked past her, stepping into the small dining room. In the center of the room sat a heavy, solid oak dining table. Arthur had built that table with his own hands the year Marcus was born. It was the table where Marcus had done his homework, where Arthur had counted his meager wages, and where Martha had prayed over countless Thanksgiving dinners. Marcus dropped a thick, glossy manila folder onto the center of the oak table. The loud smack of the paper hitting the wood echoed through the quiet house. "I'm here to finalize some business," Marcus said, his voice dropping into that smooth, ruthless corporate cadence he used in the boardroom. "Sit down, Mom, we need to talk." Martha walked over slowly, her eyes fixed on the folder. She didn't sit. She stood across the table from him, her hands resting gently on the back of one of the wooden chairs. "What is that?" "It's an eviction notice, coupled with a mandatory buyout agreement," Marcus said. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. "Vanguard Elite has officially acquired the development rights for this entire 10-block radius. We are leveling it, all of it. The Zenith project breaks ground next month." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Martha stared at him, her mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of what he had just said. Leveling it? Marcus, what are you talking about? Families live here. The Millers down the street just had a baby. Miss Shirley just renewed her. Martha's voice trailed off, a cold realization sinking into her bones. Miss Shirley will be gone by Friday. The Millers will receive their notice tomorrow, Marcus interrupted, tapping his manicured index finger against the folder. This slum has no place for people like you anymore, Mom. The property values are stagnant. The infrastructure is dead. We are sanitizing the zip code. Sanitizing. The word hit Martha like a physical blow. This is your home, Marcus, Martha whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of shock and rising grief. These are your people. These are not my people, Marcus snapped, his composure cracking for a fraction of a second, revealing the deep, festering shame underneath. I spent my entire life crawling out of this dirt so I wouldn't end up like the rest of the losers on this block. I am the vice president of Vanguard Elite. I build the future. I don't rot in the past. He pushed the folder closer to her. Sign the paper, Mom. Vanguard is offering 20% above the current assessed value for the land. It's more than fair for this dump, Marcus said, his tone softening into a patronizing sneer. Look, I know this is hard for you to understand, but I'm doing you a favor. You sign this, and I'll personally throw you some chump change from my own pocket to get you into a nice, high-end nursing home up north. One with nurses around the clock. You won't have to worry about the roof leaking or the neighborhood kids making noise. Martha looked down at the glossy folder. Then, she slowly traced her fingers along the worn grain of the oak table. She thought of Arthur. She thought of the nights he came home smelling of sulfur, his body aching, just to pay the mortgage on this exact piece of dirt. When she looked back up at her son, the tears in her eyes had dried. You want to put me in a nursing home, Martha said, her voice dangerously quiet. You want to bulldoze the house your father bled to keep, to build luxury apartments for people who would cross the street if they saw him walking toward them? Marcus rolled his eyes, letting out a harsh, bitter sigh. Oh, here we go, the martyr speech. Stop living in a fantasy, Mom. Dad didn't bleed for a legacy. He bled because he had no other choice. He died poor, with grease permanently stained under his fingernails and absolutely nothing in his bank account. Marcus leaned forward, planting his hands on Arthur's table, leaning into his mother's face. He died a nobody. I won't. I am going to be a titan in this city, and I am not going to let your sentimental attachment to a pile of worthless bricks stand in the way of my success. Bang, bang, bang. The heavy, urgent knocking on the wooden frame of the screen door shattered the tension. Martha? Everything okay in there? It was Uncle Joe. He had hobbled over from next door, his cane clutched tightly in his hand. He peered through the mesh screen, his wrinkled face creased with genuine worry. I heard shouting. Boy, why are you raising your voice at your mama? Marcus whipped his head around, his eyes blazing with furious entitlement. The intrusion of this old, frail man from the neighborhood was the ultimate insult to his perceived authority. Marcus stormed toward the front door. Mind your own business, old man. This is a private family matter. You don't come back here after 3 years just to disrespect Martha in her own house, Joe said, his voice wavering but standing his ground on the porch. Your daddy would roll over in his grave if he heard how you just. I said, back off. Marcus violently shoved the wooden screen door outward. The heavy frame slammed directly into Uncle Joe's shoulder. The impact wasn't meant to be lethal, but to a frail 75-year-old man, it was devastating. Joe lost his balance. His cane slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly against the wood, and he tumbled backward, hitting the hard porch floor with a sickening thud. Joe! Martha screamed, her heart leaping into her throat. She rushed past Marcus, pushing her son aside to drop to her knees beside the old man. Joe groaned, clutching his shoulder, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. Martha gently cradled his head, her eyes wide with terror. Joe, stay still. Let me look at you. Marcus stood in the doorway, looking down at the old man groaning on the floor. For a split second, a flicker of panic crossed his face. But then the corporate conditioning kicked in, the absolute toxic belief that money could erase any consequence. Marcus reached into his tailored suit pocket, pulled out his expensive leather money clip, and peeled off a crisp, unwrinkled $100 bill. He didn't hand it to Joe. He let it flutter down, dropping it directly onto the old man's heaving chest. "Take it and get lost," Marcus spat, looking down at his own people like they were stray dogs. "Go buy yourself some cheap liquor and forget you saw anything. If you try to sue, my lawyers will drag you through court until you die of old age." Martha froze. Her hands, which had been gently examining Joe's shoulder, stopped moving. The world around her seemed to mute. The sound of the city, the hum of the distant traffic, even Joe's pained breathing, it all faded away into a terrifying vacuum-like silence. She looked at the crisp $100 bill resting on her neighbor's chest. Then she slowly raised her eyes to look at her son. The sweet, gentle grandmother who baked peach cobbler and hummed gospel tunes was gone. The woman who had wept over her son's cruelty had vanished. In her place, something ancient, cold, and immensely powerful awakened. It was the matriarch. It was the woman who had quietly built a billion-dollar empire while the world looked the other way. Her eyes were no longer filled with maternal sorrow. They were pitch-black, bottomless pools of absolute zero coldness. Marcus felt it. Even wrapped in his bespoke suit and corporate arrogance, he felt a sudden, inexplicable chill crawl up his spine under her gaze. He took a subconscious half-step back. Martha slowly stood up. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She smoothed the front of her floral apron with unnerving, deliberate precision. "You have 24 hours to sign the paperwork, Mom," Marcus said, trying to regain his dominant posture, though his voice lacked its previous venom. "I'll have my assistant send a courier tomorrow at noon. If you don't sign, we initiate the hostile eviction process. Don't make me do that." Without waiting for a response, Marcus turned, walked quickly down the steps, and climbed into his Tesla. The tires squealed against the pavement as he sped away, fleeing the scene of his own spiritual death. Martha watched the black car disappear around the corner. She bent down, helped Uncle Joe to his feet, and handed him his cane. "Are you all right, Joe?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. "I'm fine, Martha. Just my pride that's bruised," Joe muttered, rubbing his shoulder, looking at her with deep sorrow. "I'm sorry, Martha. I'm so sorry he turned out like that." "Don't be sorry, Joe," Martha said softly, picking up the $100 bill from the porch. She folded it neatly and placed it in Joe's pocket. "Buy yourself something nice for dinner." She walked back inside the house and let the screen door click shut. She stood in the quiet dining room, looking at the heavy manila folder resting on Arthur's oak table. She didn't cry anymore. Tears were a luxury for the powerless, and Martha Hayes was the most powerful person in Chicago. She picked up the glossy folder, staring at the silver-embossed logo of Vanguard Elite. She traced the letters with her thumb. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out her encrypted smartphone. She dialed the number with steady, unwavering precision. "David," Martha said the moment the line connected. Her voice wasn't the voice of a mother. It was the voice of a titan preparing for war. "Yes, Mrs. Chairman? Cancel my afternoon gardening. Call the board members of Vanguard Elite. Call the SEC regulators. Call our entire legal team," Martha commanded, her eyes fixed on the photograph of Arthur on the dresser. "Prepare the boardroom for an emergency shareholder intervention tomorrow at 9 a.m. "Is there an agenda I should circulate, ma'am?" David asked. Martha smiled. It was a terrifying, beautiful smile. "No agenda, David," she whispered into the phone. "Just tell them it's time to teach Vanguard Elite who really owns this city. Chào bạn." Đến phần này thì nhịp độ câu chuyện bắt đầu chuyển sang một bầu không khí hoàn toàn khác. Không còn sự cam chịu hay những giọt nước mắt nghẹn ngào nữa, thay vào đó là một sự chuẩn bị lạnh lùng, sắc bén và đầy quyền lực. Cá nhân tôi khi viết phần này cảm thấy vô cùng hả hê. Bạn sẽ thấy một bà Martha lột xác hoàn toàn, bước ra khỏi căn bếp nhỏ để ngồi vào chiếc ghế quyền lực nhất. Và song song với đó, quả báo đầu tiên, Karma, cũng bắt đầu gõ cửa Marcus một cách đầy châm biếm. Mời bạn cùng tôi theo dõi cách bà Martha bày bình bố trận. Part 5, Gathering the Storm. The private elevator doors of the Thorne and Vance Law Group slid open with a soft, expensive chime. This wasn't just another law firm in the financial district. Taking up the entire 60th floor of a downtown high-rise, it was the most lethal, discreet, and unapologetically black-owned corporate litigation firm in Chicago. The walls were lined with dark mahogany and curated African-American contemporary art. The air smelled of fresh espresso, polished leather, and absolute undisputed competence. The bustling chatter of paralegals and junior partners instantly died down as the elevator doors parted. Martha stepped out. She wasn't wearing her floral apron. The worn cardigan was gone. In its place was a woman who commanded the very air she walked through. Martha wore a tailored emerald green St. John knit suit that draped perfectly over her frame. A single strand of flawless South Sea pearls rested against her crisp white silk blouse. But it was the hat that truly set the tone, a wide-brimmed, structured black church hat tilted just slightly to the side. It was the kind of hat worn by the matriarchs of the community, women who had prayed away storms and buried demons. Today, Martha wasn't here to pray. She was here to judge. As she walked down the central corridor, her heels clicking rhythmically against the Italian marble, every single person in the open-plan office, sharp, brilliant black men and women in bespoke suits, stopped what they were doing. They stood up. There were no whispered jokes about an old lady lost in the wrong building. There was only profound, silent reverence. They didn't just know her net worth. They knew her story. They knew she was the phantom queen of the South Side. David, the managing partner, was waiting at the heavy oak double doors of the primary war room. He was in his late 40s, impeccably sharp, wearing a navy blue Tom Ford suit. He bowed his head slightly as she approached. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Chairman," David said, his voice a smooth, calming baritone. "David," Martha replied, her tone perfectly even. "Tell me the trap is set." "It's not just set, ma'am," David smiled, holding the door open for her. "The jaws are locked." Martha walked into the war room. The massive glass table was covered in thick legal binders, financial printouts, and digital tablets displaying real-time stock fluctuations. 5 of the firm's top senior partners, experts in corporate acquisitions, real estate law, and forensic accounting, were already seated. They stood as Martha took her place at the head of the table. "Sit," she commanded softly. David pressed a button on a remote, and the smart glass windows frosted over, plunging the room into absolute privacy. A massive screen on the wall illuminated, displaying the corporate hierarchy and financial structuring of Vanguard Elite. "Let's review the board," Martha said, opening the leather portfolio David had placed in front of her. Vanguard Elite has been aggressively over-leveraging themselves for the past 2 years, blinded by the projected profits of the Zenith project, David explained, bringing up a complex web of financial transfers on the screen. To secure the capital needed to bribe zoning officials and buy out the South Side, Richard Sterling authorized the secret issuance of preferred voting shares. He thought he was selling them to fragmented offshore holding companies to maintain his own control. Martha's lips curled into a cold, predatory smile. He didn't realize those holding companies all lead back to the same address. "Exactly," David nodded, tapping the screen. The 15 different offshore logos suddenly dissolved, merging into a single glowing crest, the Arthur and Martha Legacy Trust. Over the last 6 months, we have quietly absorbed every single share they put on the secondary market. As of 8 a.m. this morning, your trust officially controls 81.4% of the voting rights for Vanguard Elite. Richard Sterling thinks he is the CEO. In reality, he is just an employee living on borrowed time. Martha traced her finger over the printed organizational chart until it stopped on the Vice President of Urban Development, Marcus Hayes. A heavy silence fell over the war room. The lawyers knew about Marcus. They knew the heartbreaking irony of a son trying to bulldoze his own mother's empire without knowing she owned the bulldozers.
"And my son?"
Martha asked, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "Did he sign the accelerated eviction protocols?" David swallowed hard, pulling a document from a red folder. He slid it across the glass table. "He signed them 2 hours ago, ma'am. He also authorized the use of aggressive private security contractors to intimidate the elderly renters on 8th Street who refused the initial buyout offers." Martha stared at Marcus's signature. The crisp, arrogant loops of ink. He had officially signed off on terrorizing his own people. The last flickering ember of maternal hesitation inside Martha's heart extinguished, leaving behind nothing but cold, refined steel. "David," Martha said, not looking up from the paper, "initiate the lockdown protocol. I want a forensic audit launched immediately on every executive involved in the Zenith. Look for embezzlement, misused company funds, tax fraud. Find every skeleton Richard Sterling and Marcus Hayes have buried. Consider it done. And David?" Martha looked up, her dark eyes flashing with lethal intent. "Freeze their corporate expense accounts. Instantly. I want them to feel the air leaving the room before the door even opens." Across town, 50 floors above the city, the air was still thin, but Marcus Hayes was breathing easy. The Apex Lounge was an ultra-exclusive, members-only rooftop bar that catered to Chicago's financial elite. The lighting was low, the jazz was live, and a single cocktail cost more than a week's groceries in the South Side. Marcus sat in a curved leather booth, surrounded by Richard Sterling and 3 other white executives from Vanguard Elite. The table was littered with crystal tumblers, half-eaten Wagyu sliders, and a freshly opened bottle of Louis XIII cognac. Marcus felt invincible. He had just delivered the Zenith paperwork, effectively securing his promotion to senior vice president. "I have to hand it to you, Marcus." Richard laughed, his face flushed red from the cognac. He clapped Marcus on the back, spilling a little of his drink. "When you said you could handle those stubborn locals, I had my doubts. People in those neighborhoods, they usually throw a massive tantrum. Protests, news cameras, the whole headache. How did you get the primary holdout to agree?" Marcus swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his chest puffing out with manufactured pride. He thought of his mother, standing in her floral apron, looking at the $100 bill he had thrown at Uncle Joe. He buried the sudden sting of guilt under a layer of arrogance. "It's just about showing them the reality of modern economics, Richard." Marcus smirked, taking a sip of the cognac. "Old people, you know. They get sentimental over rotting wood and bad plumbing. Sometimes you just have to give them a firm push. Show them they have no leverage. Once they realize they can't win, they fold." Richard threw his head back and laughed loudly, oblivious to the fact that he was applauding a man for destroying his own mother. "A firm push. I love it. You're ruthless, Marcus. You have the killer instinct. To the zenith! To the zenith!" Marcus echoed, clinking his heavy crystal glass against Richard's. A waiter in a crisp white tuxedo vest approached the table, carrying a silver tray with a small black leather booklet. The bill. It was exorbitant, nearly $4,000 for the afternoon's celebration. "I've got this one, gentlemen," Marcus announced smoothly, waving Richard away. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his sleek, heavy metal Vanguard Elite Corporate American Express card. The ultimate status symbol. He dropped it onto the silver tray without even looking at the receipt. "Keep the change, my friend." The waiter nodded politely and walked away. Marcus leaned back, crossing his legs, basking in the glow of his own perceived power. He was finally one of them. He had made it. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The waiter returned, but his polite smile had vanished, replaced by a look of awkward, professional discomfort. He leaned in close to Marcus, keeping his voice low to avoid a scene. "I apologize, Mr. Hayes," the waiter whispered, placing the black card back on the table. The transaction was declined. Marcus frowned, his perfect corporate mask slipping for a fraction of a second. He let out a forced, dismissive chuckle. "Declined? That's impossible. It's a corporate Centurion card with no preset limit. Run it again. The machine is probably glitching." "I did run it twice, sir," the waiter replied, shifting uncomfortably. "The terminal didn't just decline it. It gave a code 404. The issuer has placed a hard freeze on the account. It says, board level lockdown." Marcus's stomach dropped. A sudden, icy chill swept through his veins, completely sobering him up. Board level lockdown? That code was only used when an executive was under active investigation for severe financial misconduct. It was the corporate equivalent of a death sentence. Richard, noticing the prolonged interaction, leaned over, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Everything all right, Marcus? Need me to cover it?" The condescension in Richard's voice was subtle, but it hit Marcus like a physical blow. The illusion of his equality was instantly shattered. To Richard, a declined card meant Marcus was suddenly unreliable. It's just a bank error," Marcus stammered, frantically reaching into his wallet for his personal platinum card. He handed it to the waiter, his hands trembling slightly. "Fraud protection, probably. You know how these banks are, right? Bank error," Richard said slowly, his smile fading into a look of cold, calculating scrutiny. He pulled away from Marcus slightly, the warmth of their previous camaraderie evaporating into the chilled air of the lounge. The waiter returned 3 minutes later. He didn't look at Marcus. He looked at Richard. "Sir, the personal card was also flagged and locked by the Associated Banking Network," the waiter said quietly. Marcus felt the blood drain entirely from his face. His personal accounts were linked to the same wealth management firm that handled Vanguard's payroll. If both were locked, it meant someone high up, someone with terrifying, ungodly power, had intentionally pulled the plug on his entire financial existence. Richard didn't say a word. He simply pulled out his own card, handed it to the waiter, and stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Thanks for the drink, Marcus," Richard said, his voice completely devoid of its previous warmth. He looked down at Marcus as if he were suddenly looking at a stranger. "Get your banking sorted out. We have a major shareholder meeting tomorrow morning. Don't bring this mess into the boardroom." Richard and the other executives walked away, leaving Marcus alone in the booth. The jazz music playing in the background suddenly sounded distorted. Marcus stared at his frozen black corporate card lying uselessly on the table. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking violently, and saw 3 urgent voicemails from his wealth manager. He had no idea what was happening. He thought he was the architect of the future. He didn't realize that the woman he had tried to bury in the past had already bought the graveyard, locked the gates, and thrown away the key. Back in the war room at Thorne and Vance, Martha stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the Chicago skyline. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows over the steel and glass towers. David walked up behind her quietly. "The accounts are frozen, Mrs. Chairman. The audit has begun. Vanguard Elite is effectively paralyzed." Martha didn't smile. She looked at the reflection of her own face in the glass, studying the tired, resolute lines etched around her eyes. "Are you prepared for tomorrow morning, Martha?" David asked softly, stepping out of his lawyer persona for a moment to speak to her as a friend. "He is your son. When you drop this hammer, there is no taking it back. It will destroy the reality he built." Martha closed her eyes. She thought of Marcus as a little boy, running through the sprinklers on 8th Street, laughing with a pure, uncorrupted joy. Then she thought of the man in the charcoal suit, throwing a $100 bill at an old man's pain. "He stopped being my son the moment he put a price tag on our people, David." Martha whispered into the glass, her voice carrying the heavy, agonizing weight of a mother's ultimate sacrifice. "Tomorrow, I don't just take his company, I take his pride. He needs to learn that roots are the only things that hold a tree up when the storm comes." Martha opened her eyes. The sorrow was gone. The storm was here. "Draft the termination papers, David. Tomorrow, Vanguard Elite burns." "Chào bạn." Cuối cùng thì chúng ta cũng bước vào khoảnh khắc bùng nổ nhất. Cái giây phút mà mọi kìm nén, mọi sự kiêu ngạo và những dối trá sẽ bị lột sạch sành xanh dưới ánh sáng của sự thật. Viết đến phần này, tôi cảm thấy một sự thỏa mãn tột độ. Đây không chỉ là một màn trả đũa thông thường, mà nó là sự đòi lại công lý, đòi lại danh dự cho cả một cộng đồng đã bị bóc lột và coi thường. Việc để bà Martha bước vào sao huyệt của những kẻ tự xưng là tinh hoa và nghiền nát chúng bằng chính luật chơi của chúng. Chà, đó là một cảm giác thực sự vĩ đại. Tôi đã sử dụng tối đa các kỹ thuật miêu tả tâm lý, nhịp độ, chậm rãi nhưng dồn dập ở những đoạn cao trào để đẩy cảm xúc của khán giả lên mức cao nhất. Khán giả Mỹ gốc Phi chắc chắn sẽ đứng dậy vỗ tay cho phân đoạn này. Mời bạn bước vào căn phòng họp rực lửa. Part 6, The Boardroom Reveal. The morning sun hit the mirrored glass of the Vanguard Elite Tower, casting a blinding golden glare across the downtown Chicago skyline. Inside the 50th floor boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with the intoxicating scent of impending wealth. It was 8:55 a.m. The emergency shareholder meeting was set to begin in 5 minutes. Richard Sterling stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, a bottle of vintage Dom Perignon in his hand. The pop of the cork echoed sharply, a celebratory gunshot in the sterilized air. He poured the bubbling golden liquid into a row of crystal flutes, his face flushed with the kind of arrogance that only comes from decades of unchecked privilege. Around the table, the other board members, a sea of tailored navy suits and silver hair, were laughing, trading jokes about golf handicaps and summer homes in the Hamptons. Marcus sat near the front, a flute of champagne resting untouched in front of him. On the outside, he looked impeccable. His charcoal suit was perfectly pressed, his tie immaculate, but inside he was spiraling. He hadn't slept a wink. He had spent the entire night frantically calling his bank, his wealth manager, his credit card concierges, only to be met with automated messages and terrified, evasive representatives who refused to explain the board-level lockdown on his life. He took a slow breath, forcing his hands to stop trembling under the table. It's just a glitch, he told himself for the 100th time. Once Richard announces the acquisition of the Southside properties today, my bonus kicks in. The banks will clear it up. I am untouchable. Gentlemen, Richard announced, raising his glass. The room quieted down. Today is a monumental day for Vanguard Elite. Today, we finalize the aggressive restructuring of the 8th Street corridor. The Zenith project is officially greenlit. We are not just building condos. We are redefining the socio-economic landscape of this city. We are taking the dirt and we are turning it into gold. The board members murmured their agreements, raising their glasses. And I want to personally thank our newly appointed Senior Vice President, Marcus Hayes, Richard continued, gesturing toward Marcus with a patronizing, benevolent smile, for doing the dirty work required to clear out the stubborn elements of his old neighborhood. He proved that he knows exactly where his loyalties lie. Marcus forced a smile and raised his glass. The champagne tasted like ash in his mouth. It was 9 a.m. exactly. The heavy, frosted glass doors of the boardroom did not just open. They were shoved apart with a violent synchronized force that made the thick glass shudder in its tracks. The laughter in the room died instantly. 4 towering men stepped into the boardroom. They wore identical, impeccably tailored black suits, earpieces discreetly coiled behind their necks. They didn't look like standard corporate security. They moved with the silent, lethal precision of a private military detail. 2 of them flanked the doors, while the other 2 stepped forward, creating a clear, heavily guarded path into the room. Richard lowered his champagne glass, his face flushing with immediate outrage. What the hell is the meaning of this? This is a closed board meeting. Security. The 4 men didn't blink. They didn't move. They simply stared straight ahead, completely ignoring the CEO. Then David stepped through the doors. The lead attorney of Thorne & Vance looked like a predator entering a cage full of slow, overfed prey. He carried a single, thick, black leather briefcase. He walked smoothly to the center of the room, his eyes sweeping over the bewildered board members with chilling amusement. "Good morning, gentlemen," David said, his baritone voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "My name is David Vance, managing partner at Thorne & Vance Law Group. I am here representing the majority shareholder of Vanguard Elite." Richard scoffed, slamming his glass down on the table. "Majority shareholder? Are you out of your mind? Vanguard's preferred shares are held by 15 independent offshore trusts. We don't have a single majority shareholder, you arrogant." "Actually, Richard," a new voice cut through the air. It was a woman's voice. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a resonant, gravitational weight that commanded the room to absolute, terrified silence. The security detail parted. Martha stepped into the boardroom. The transformation was absolute. She wasn't the fragile woman in the floral apron. She was draped in a breathtaking emerald green St. John knit suit that radiated power. Flawless South Sea pearls rested against her collarbone, and perched atop her neatly woven silver loques was a structured, wide-brimmed black church hat, a crown of quiet, unyielding authority. She walked with the slow, deliberate grace of a queen inspecting a conquered province. Marcus stopped breathing. His eyes widened so far they felt like they were burning. His mind violently rejected the image in front of him. It was impossible. It was a hallucination. His mother, the woman who baked peach cobbler, the woman he had thrown $100 bill at yesterday, the woman he had told to pack her bags for a nursing home, was standing in the epicenter of white corporate power, looking like she owned the very air they were breathing.
Mom?
Marcus choked out, his voice cracking, sounding like a terrified little boy. He pushed his chair back, standing up on shaky legs. What? What are you doing here? You can't be here. Security, get this crazy old woman out of the building.
Martha didn't even look at her son.
Her dark, obsidian eyes were locked entirely on Richard Sterling. Richard didn't yell for security. He didn't scoff. Richard's face drained of all color, turning a sickly, translucent shade of gray. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his trembling fingers. It hit the mahogany table, shattering into a dozen jagged pieces, the expensive champagne spilling over the financial reports. Richard recognized David Vance. He knew the reputation of the law firm, and as his eyes moved from the lawyer to the black woman commanding the room, the terrifying, catastrophic truth hit him like a freight train. "Mrs. Chairman?" Richard whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. The other board members gasped, looking between Richard and the elderly black woman in utter disbelief. "Hello, Richard," Martha said, her voice smooth and cold as polished ice. She walked past Marcus as if he were nothing more than a piece of unwanted furniture. She walked directly to the head of the table. Richard instinctively stumbled backward, yielding his chair. Martha stood at the head of the table. She unclasped her black leather clutch and pulled out a thick, glossy manila folder. It was the exact same folder Marcus had thrown onto her oak dining table 24 hours earlier. She held it up for a moment, letting the room stare at it, before she violently slammed it down onto the mahogany table. The loud smack echoed like a gunshot. Marcus flinched. "My son came to my house yesterday," Martha began, her voice carrying the rhythm and cadence of a seasoned preacher delivering a eulogy. She finally turned her gaze to Marcus. The temperature in the room plummeted. He threw this eviction notice on the table his father built with his bare, bleeding hands. "He told me that my home, my community, my history was a slum." She paused, letting her eyes slowly sweep across the pale, terrified faces of the white board members. "He told me," Martha continued, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "that he would throw me some chump change from his own pocket so I could quietly disappear into a nursing home. He told me not to stand in the way of his success." Martha placed her hands flat on the table, leaning forward, claiming the physical space of the room. "I thought about his generous offer," Martha said, offering a smile that sent shivers down Marcus's spine. "And I decided to use that chump change to buy the chair you are sitting in, Marcus. In fact, I used it to buy this entire building." David stepped forward, opening his black briefcase. He began tossing thick bound legal documents onto the table, sliding them toward the board members. As of 8 a.m. yesterday, the Arthur and Martha Legacy Trust fully consolidated its holdings, David announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. The 15 offshore trusts Richard Sterling thought he was using to hide company assets are, and have always been, shell corporations wholly owned by Mrs. Martha Hayes. She holds 81.4% of Vanguard Elite's voting rights. She is the undisputed majority shareholder, the chairwoman of the board, and as of this exact moment, the sole acting authority of this firm. Pandemonium threatened to break out. Board members frantically opened the documents, their eyes scanning the unassailable legal proof. "This is illegal. This is a hostile takeover," one of the senior executives shouted, his face red with panic. "It is entirely legal, gentlemen." "It's simple economics," Martha said, throwing Richard's exact words back at him with devastating precision. She turned to the CEO, who was currently clutching the edge of the table as if the floor were falling away beneath him. "Richard," Martha said softly, "I heard you had a little laugh yesterday. I heard you referred to my people, to the families who have survived generations of systemic starvation, as riffraff, as trash that needed to be swept out." Richard opened his mouth, stammering, beads of cold sweat dripping down his temples. "Martha, Mrs. Chairman, please, you have to understand context. It was boardroom talk, a poor choice of words I have the utmost respect for. Save your breath, Richard. You're polluting my air, Martha cut him off, her voice cracking like a whip. You wanted to sanitize the zip code. I think that's a brilliant idea, but I'm starting the sanitization process at the top. Martha looked at David. David nodded and pulled a red folder from his briefcase. Since midnight, our forensic accounting team has been conducting a deep dive audit into Vanguard's internal ledgers, David announced to the room. We found over $14 million in misappropriated corporate funds disguised as consulting fees for the Zenith project, funneled directly into Richard Sterling's private accounts in the Cayman Islands. We also found deliberate tax fraud, falsified environmental impact reports, and evidence of bribing city zoning officials. Richard's legs gave out. He collapsed into an empty chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. His career, his wealth, his freedom, gone in less than 60 seconds. Richard Sterling, Martha declared, her voice echoing with the weight of absolute judgment. You are terminated, effective immediately, without severance, without your stock options. My legal team has already forwarded the audit to the SEC and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I suggest you use whatever money you have left to hire a very good defense attorney. She motioned to the guards.
Escort Mr. Sterling off my property.
Two of the massive security guards stepped forward, grabbing Richard by the arms and hauling him to his feet. The CEO didn't fight. He was a hollowed-out shell as they dragged him out of the boardroom. The remaining board members sat frozen, terrified to even breathe, waiting to see who the angel of death would point to next. Martha slowly turned her head, her dark eyes locked onto Marcus. Marcus was hyperventilating. His perfect corporate mask was shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The reality of what he had done, who he had betrayed, and the unimaginable magnitude of the empire he had mocked was crushing his chest like a physical weight. He had sold his soul to sit at a table that his mother actually owned. Mom. Marcus whimpered, taking a step toward her, his hands raised in a desperate, pleading gesture. Mom, please. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know. If you had just told me, if I had told you. Martha interrupted, her voice trembling, not with sadness, but with a profound, terrifying maternal rage. If you knew I was a billionaire, you would have treated me with respect? Is that what you are telling me, Marcus? That the only way your mother, your history, your blood deserves dignity is if it comes with a 9-figure bank account? No, that's not what I mean, Marcus cried out, tears of sheer panic streaming down his face, ruining his immaculate appearance. I was just trying to survive in this world. I was trying to build a legacy. Your father built a legacy. Martha roared, her voice finally breaking its calm, the raw, unbridled pain of decades of struggle echoing through the room. He bled for that dirt. We bought back our neighborhood so that little black boys like you would never have to bow your heads to men like Richard Sterling. And what did you do with that sacrifice? You tried to sell it back to them for a pat on the head and a corner office. Marcus flinched as if he had been struck across the face. He looked around the room. The white executives he had spent years trying to impress were staring at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. He was nothing to them. He was nothing to his mother. He was entirely, utterly alone. Mom, please, Marcus sobbed, the polished vice president dissolving into a terrified, broken man. He fell to his knees right there on the expensive boardroom carpet. He crawled a few inches forward, reaching out to touch the hem of her emerald skirt. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll fix it. I'll cancel the Zenith. I'll do whatever you want. Just please. You're my mother. Don't do this to me. Please, Mom. The room was dead silent, save for the pathetic, gasping sobs of the man on the floor. Martha looked down at the son she had carried in her womb, the son she had scrubbed floors to send to college. For a fleeting second, the mother inside her ached to reach down and pull him up. But then she remembered Uncle Joe clutching his shoulder on the porch. She remembered the eviction notices. She remembered the arrogance in Marcus's eyes when he called his own people trash. A tree cannot grow if its roots are rotten. Sometimes you have to sever the infected branch to save the tree. Martha took a deliberate step back, pulling the fabric of her skirt out of his desperate grasp. The man who called me Mom yesterday. Martha said, her voice dropping back to that cold absolute whisper, is the same man who called my community a slum. He is the same man who threw money at an elder's pain. That man is dead to me. Marcus looked up, his eyes wide with absolute horror as the finality of her words struck him. Place your corporate badge and your company car keys on the table, Marcus, Martha commanded, her face an unreadable mask of stone. With trembling, defeated hands, Marcus reached into his pockets. He pulled out the heavy metal Tesla key fob and unclipped his vice president's security badge. He laid them on the mahogany table. The metallic clink sounded like the closing of a coffin. You are fired. Your accounts will remain frozen while the forensic audit investigates your involvement in Richard's embezzlement, Martha said, turning away from him, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city she now controlled. But I have nothing, Marcus wailed, his voice cracking in sheer desperation. The mortgage on my house, the car loans. I'll lose everything. What am I supposed to do? Martha looked at him over her shoulder. Her eyes were empty of all warmth. You can take the chump change in your pocket, she said softly, and find yourself a nice quiet place to rot in the past. She turned to the two remaining security guards. I am Chairman Martha, she stated, her voice echoing with the undisputed power of a self-made titan. Remove this man from my building, and if he ever sets foot on Vanguard property again, have him arrested for trespassing. Mom, no! Mom! Marcus screamed, thrashing and fighting as the two massive guards hauled him off the floor by his armpits. His tailored suit tore at the shoulder. He kicked and sobbed, his dignity completely stripped away as he was dragged backward out of the boardroom. His screams echoed down the hallway, growing fainter and fainter until the heavy frosted glass doors slid shut, sealing his fate. The boardroom was silent again. The remaining executives sat paralyzed in their chairs, staring at the black woman standing at the head of the table. Martha took a slow, deep breath, adjusting the brim of her church hat. She picked up the manila folder containing the Zenith Project, ripped it cleanly in half, and tossed it into the trash can. Now, Martha said, sitting down in the CEO's leather chair, looking at the terrified board of directors. Let's talk about building affordable housing on the South Side. Who has the first proposal? The polished marble plaza outside the Vanguard Elite Tower had always been Marcus's favorite runway. Today, it was his walk of shame. He stumbled through the heavy revolving doors, clutching a cheap cardboard box filled with a few desk trinkets and a framed Ivy League degree that suddenly felt entirely worthless. His bespoke charcoal suit was deeply wrinkled, the shoulder seam violently torn from where the guards had hauled him across the floor. Marcus stood on the curb, instinctively reaching into his pocket for his Tesla key fob, only to remember it was sitting on the mahogany table 50 floors above him. His accounts were frozen, his credit was locked. He looked up at the towering glass skyscraper he had worshipped for so long. It didn't look back. The corporate machine had already moved on, indifferent to his existence. Need a taxi, Mr. Hayes? A voice called out. Marcus turned. It was one of the lobby valets, a young black man whom Marcus had actively ignored every single morning for 3 years. The valet was leaning against his podium, a knowing, slightly amused smirk playing on his lips. He didn't offer to hail a cab. He just watched. Marcus lowered his head, his cheeks burning with a humiliation so profound it physically ached. Without a word, he turned his back on the glass tower and began the long, agonizing walk toward the public bus stop. 18 months later, the air on the South Side smelled of fresh paint, blooming jasmine, and the mouth-watering aroma of Ms. Shirley's weekend barbecue block party. There were no glass infinity pools on 8th Street. There were no artisanal, overpriced juice bars. But the neighborhood had been transformed. The cracked pavements were smoothed and lined with newly planted oak trees. The old, decaying apartment buildings hadn't been bulldozed. They had been meticulously renovated, their historic brick facades restored to their original, dignified glory. A massive, wrought iron archway stood at the entrance of the newly paved block. The gold lettering gleamed in the afternoon sun, the Arthur Hayes Community Housing Trust. It was a sanctuary, affordable rent-controlled townhomes dedicated exclusively to single black mothers working-class families, and the elderly residents who had anchored the community for decades. Black-owned businesses filled the commercial strip, thriving without the suffocating threat of predatory rent hikes. Martha sat on the porch of her modest brick house. She still hadn't moved. She still wore her floral apron, and her hands were still covered in the rich, dark soil of her garden. She took a slow sip of her sweet tea, listening to the joyful shrieks of children playing double dutch on the safe, sunlit sidewalks. They tell us that to be somebody, we have to leave our people behind. They tell us that success looks like a glass tower, and that the dirt we come from is something to be washed off. But a tree without roots is just waiting for the wind to knock it down. Martha looked down at the photograph of Arthur resting on the porch railing beside her. She smiled, a deep, peaceful smile. Money can buy you a lot of things. It can buy you a corner office. It can buy you a tailored suit, but it cannot buy you a legacy. And it sure as hell can't buy back your dignity once you've sold it to the highest bidder. Real wealth isn't about how high you can climb. It's about how many people you can pull up with you. Never sell your soul. Never forget your roots.